It's one thing for linguistics to study a language, to make models of what it is we know when we know a language, but that isn't as far as it goes. The reason is that languages impact on so many things. They're so important in human affairs, and so the discipline of linguistics interacts with other disciplines and forms what I like to think of as interdisciplines. That is the process of taking the findings of two adjacent areas of science and seeing how they interact. But also, because languages are important, the knowledge that linguists acquire is significant in a number of other areas and can be applied, and so there are areas of applied linguistics, and in this movie I'll look at some of those just to let you see that linguistics isn't just a little subject on its own looking at languages, but it has a number of really interesting relationships with other areas. First of all, sociolinguistics. As you might have guessed, the socio has to do with social and the linguistics has to do with linguistics. It looks at how language is used in a social context. Of course, language is always used in a social context. It's virtually impossible to not be in a social context because human beings are social beings and they live in societies, and so whenever they talk there is a social context out there and it always has an impact. In most societies there is social stratification of one sort or another, and the way in which people use language often reflects the social order that they're in. Quite often, if you have upper caste, upper class folks, they will speak differently from lower class folks, and that will be obvious to all of you who live in a socially stratified society. Brahmin in India speak differently from untouchables, even if both of them are speaking English as opposed to their home languages. It's also clear that in many societies, men and women don't use language in quite the same way. One of the major areas of research in the last 30 years has been to investigate the way in which the genders use language in different ways. At the beginning that tended to be all men do this and all women do that, but that turns out not to be the case. It's a matter of subtle differences, for example in pronunciation, in word use, and there's often a very considerable degree of overlap. Nevertheless, if you look at the norms involved, men and women quite often don't use language in exactly the same way. There are clearly in most societies occupations, and occupations of one sort or another can be seen in the way in which language is used. If you enter a doctor's surgery and the nurse asks you to come to the doctor's surgery, the first thing that she'll say is next or something like that. She might say call your name, and then the doctor might say, well, how are you today? What can I help you with? Or what seems to be the trouble? Well, what seems to be the trouble is one of those phrases that tends to be used by doctors. It doesn't tend to be used at the supermarket checkout, where the checkout operator doesn't say, hello, what seems to be the trouble? They ask you whether you want to pay by cash or check. So language use and occupation can be studied, and the interaction between them can be understood after a while. There are societies in which almost everyone is bilingual. In Singapore, almost everyone speaks English. All the native Singaporeans speak English, but they also almost always have a home language, which might be a variety of Chinese, or they might speak Tamil if they're from southern India, or they might speak Malay. And this bilingualism is related to all sorts of things, and it also relates often to code switching, which is what happens when people have more than one language and they flick from one to the other depending on all sorts of things. It's very interesting to ask, what is it that makes you switch from, say, English to Tamil if you're a Tamil-speaking Singaporean? Why do you do that? Under what circumstances? And again, those tend to be socially sensitive. The second interdiscipline I'd just like to draw your attention to is psycholinguistics, and that hasn't got to do with linguists who are psycho. It has to do with the interaction between psychology and linguistics. It looks at how language is, for example, acquired by humans. The acquisition of language is a fascinating area because we're not born with a particular language. That's quite clear because babies don't all speak Tamil, for example, or Kwakiutl. They speak the language of the people around them. So, on the one hand, it might be the case that we speak whatever anyone else is speaking, but there are areas where languages have so much in common that we now think that there are pre-existing psychological factors that lead to people acquiring the sort of languages they do. Clearly, acquisition has a developmental history. At 6 months, a lot of babies are making clicking noises like, and why would they do that? They don't hear those noises around them. Why do they babble and goo and make the sort of noises they do? Well, that's part of their developmental history, and we can study that history and then say, well, what happens at what stages? What sort of landmarks are there on the way to a full adult competence in a language? Speech is also created in real time. We use our mouths making noises without having to delay. What you want to say, you say pretty much on the hoof, rather than saying, look, give us another 5 minutes and I'll make up a sentence for you. We do it in real time. That's a very significant capacity because we speak at about 4, 5, 6 syllables a second, depending on how fast we're going, and we never seem to get behind. We get slightly faster in the middle of sentences and slightly slower at the edges of them. Nevertheless, we have no idea as to how we actually do that. We do it extremely rapidly with great fluency and with apparently little effort. Well, psycholinguists are interested in that. Speech production is well worth their attention. So, of course, is speech perception. If we speak at 4, 5, 6 syllables a second, then we're also hearing at that rate, and we are able to process everything that we hear, which of course is just sound initially, but we're able to decode that sound and make sense of it at the same time as the person who is speaking it. There is a short delay, but it's very short. Again, nobody says at a particular stage when they're listening to someone, I'm sorry, I'm 4 sentences behind you at the moment, could you slow down? The only time that happens is if the hearer doesn't in fact know the language very well. For native speakers, the speed at which others speak isn't a problem. So speech perception is interesting. How do we take the sounds that impact on our ears and turn them into meaningful sound by processing them in the brain? Psycholinguistics looks at that. And of course, finally, it has to look at how language is stored in the brain. What kind of things are stored? Obviously, everybody's got a dictionary in their brain. You must have. Without a dictionary, you couldn't produce sentences, and you couldn't understand the words that you do in fact understand. Somewhere in there is a dictionary, and you look it up. Vocabulary has to be accessed. But there must be other things as well that enable you to take sentences apart, see how they're formed, and make the complex messages in sentences make sense to you. Underneath psycholinguistics, there has to be neurolinguistics. We have to actually understand what it is in the brain that enables the language to be stored at all, and not just stored, but for the words to be accessed and so forth. That's been an interest at least since the middle of the 19th century. Where is language? When you look at a brain, whereabouts is it? Is it all over the place, or is it in one particular location? In the last few years, it's become easier in some ways to look at that because brain imaging equipment has become more common. What it does is it looks at blood flows in different parts of the brain, and the assumption is that when a particular part of the brain is at work, the blood flow to that part of the brain increases, and you can look at that in various ways by taking electronic slices through your brain and saying, oh yes, there's more blood flow there, so when I ask someone to do something and that's where the blood flow is going, that's where the action must be. So brain imaging is helping people understand more and more about the neurolinguistics of brains. Well as all these interdisciplines, and there are more that I haven't talked about, there are areas of applied linguistics which are also significant. One of the earliest, and it has been going on for 150 years at least, is creating writing systems for languages which don't have them. For the vast history of human existence, and certainly since we started speaking, which is now thought to have been about 200,000, maybe 150,000 years ago, people spoke without having writing systems. Writing systems are very recent, of the order of 3,000 or 4,000 years maybe, but they're very important. Of course, we've come to rely on them. The tax department in particular relies on them. How can you tax someone if they can't fill in a tax return? So all over the world where there are people who don't have writing systems, other people are busy creating writing systems for them, and linguists are heavily involved in that. Education is another significant area. Think, for example, of foreign language teaching. If you understand something of the language that you're teaching, that might help you teach it to someone else. In particular, in the whole of the English-speaking world, there is a subject called English. Well, that's weird, isn't it? These children already speak English. What are we doing teaching English to people who already speak it? Well, you've been through all of this. That's why you're able to understand what's happening at the moment. So you must know what you did at school, and some of that is affected by linguistics. It's a form of applied linguistics. On top of that, and certainly in the last 100 years, increasingly in the last 50 years, the teaching of English as a foreign or second language has become very important. What's the difference? Well, generally, English as a foreign language is when people in other countries learn English so that when they go to England or watch an English movie, they can understand what's going on. In a number of other places, English is a second language. For example, if migrants come to an English-speaking country, then they develop English as a second language, and often there are courses available for them to learn English as a second language, since they'll be using it on a daily basis. The industry of teaching English as a foreign or a second language is now one of the biggest industries in the world. There are language schools almost everywhere. In small cities all over the planet, there are people teaching English. There are expert English teachers teaching English to bankers in Prague. There are little language schools in Budapest teaching English. Even in my city, Christchurch, New Zealand, there are dozens of language schools teaching English as a second or foreign language. So this is a very significant area. And when you're training as a teacher of English as a foreign language, what you often get taught is a fair bit of linguistics, which you then apply to the job of being an English teacher. Speech and language therapy is another area that linguistics is useful for. Most people learn a language without any bother. They start when they're about 1, and by the time they're attending primary school, they've got most of it pretty much under control. They learn a lot more vocabulary as they get older, but basically the language is established. So why do we need speech and language therapy? Well, under certain circumstances, the normal developmental sequence that I talked about earlier, the milestones that most people get to at particular stages of their childhood, those are disturbed in some way, they're disordered, and speech and language therapists can be helpful in getting people back up to speed with their language learning. More significantly these days are the acquired speech disorders. You can basically acquire those in a number of ways, but the two most common are having a stroke, and under those circumstances, if that part of the brain where there is language stuff housed, then the stroke will disorder your speech, sometimes very, very badly. There are forms of aphasia, which is the speech disorder caused by brain injury, where people really can't do much at all. Their language is almost completely obliterated. That's a very serious matter, because if you think of yourself without being able to speak, even if you could hear whatever anybody else was saying, it would be incredibly frustrating. Well, speech therapists help with that. The other area where speech disorders may be acquired is through accidents of one sort or another, often motor car accidents where someone bangs their head through the windscreen of their car or comes off a motorbike, and they're subject to brain injury, and again those can be quite severe, and speech disorders can be sizable, and often speech and language therapists come in to help in recovery stages of accidents and after strokes. Computing doesn't seem like the sort of area where linguistics would be much use, but if you listen to your computer, you can actually get it to talk. There are computers now, most of them in fact, where if you have the right software and you've written your essay or your letter to Uncle Fred, it will read it out to you. Well, linguists have been involved in that. These are called natural language interfaces, and they're of two sorts. The computer can talk to you, or you can talk to it. And machine translation is another area where linguists are heavily involved. Machine translation is a kind of holy grail. Everyone would like it to happen, and if you imagine how it would be if you could do it, you would basically feed a Japanese text into one end of a machine, and the equivalent English translation would appear out of the other end. In the general case, that's impossible, but there are a few cases where it seems to work quite well. We know that weather forecasts are very stereotypical. Pretty much the same kinds of things happen. If we were to say what happens in a stereotypical way, then the same weather situation would be able to be described in language A and language B if you had a kind of neutral code. For example, if it was going to rain tomorrow and you had a way of saying that in language A, then you could also say it in language B, and a number of computer scientists have worked on machine translation in these rather stereotypical environments, and there it can work rather well. Speech recognition is also important. If a computer was really very clever, you would just talk to it. You wouldn't type anything in, you'd just talk to it. But not only would it recognize what you said, it would understand it. There are situations where that's, again, quite impossible, but there are other situations where speech recognition can work rather well. Let's suppose that there are 26 commands that you could potentially give to a machine, a robot of one sort or another. If those 26 commands were given in very much the same way every time, a computer might gradually be able to understand different people who said those commands, and under certain circumstances that could be quite handy. If it could be told to sort of go a little left, a little right, you can imagine a little car running around a laboratory and being able to tell it to turn left 3 degrees, turn right 4 degrees. It might be able to understand speech, provided that the speech was pretty limited to a small number of areas. In general, speech recognition is going to be very difficult, but who knows? Linguists are always going to be involved, so that's good for us. Speech synthesis is the process where the computer ends up talking to you. And as I said, that's possible when it reads off a written text, and for some people, particularly people with handicaps of various sorts, that can be a very useful thing for a computer to do. In international relations and intranational relations, linguists are also important because international relations are facilitated by people talking to each other. They go to conferences and they have a chat. Well, there are languages that are used for that. The European Union is a good example. The Union has a set of official languages, which are all the official languages of the nation states that belong to the Union, but it also has working languages which it uses for conferences, and that's not the total number of languages that are official languages for the European Union. There are countries in which there are lots of different languages, so inside a nation state there have to be intranational relations, and those are facilitated by particular kinds of languages. Well, international relations are facilitated through international languages, and often those are very big languages, languages spoken by lots and lots of people, so English and German and French and Spanish and so on, Chinese languages, Japanese. But they're not facilitated by one of the community languages of Vanuatu spoken by 300 people, and nobody's going to use one of those languages for international relations. Standard languages are languages that are used within a nation state where there are more languages than one, and again it's a very interesting question as to which language should be used in a nation state where there are a number of languages spoken. Thinking about Vanuatu again, where there are 40-something languages at least spoken, what language should be picked as the standard language? Colonial overseers of Vanuatu were English-speaking and French-speaking. Well, those are possibilities, but there was also a pidgin language used all over Vanuatu, not by everybody, but it was widely used, called Bislama. Well, Bislama is now a standard language of Vanuatu. All of this comes about through having national languages policies, and a lot of countries have those, in which the different languages of the nation state are sort of laid down and which ones can be used for which purpose. Australia, for example, has a national languages policy developed in the 70s, 80s and 90s, and that facilitates the acquisition of English by migrants. It supports the use of community languages from migrant groups, and in Vanuatu there's also a national languages policy, and one of the things you might care to look up is whether your country has a national languages policy and what it actually says about the languages that are spoken in your area. Clearly, if you have more than one language and if you have migrants and tourists coming through, then there need to be translation services. Under the UN Declaration of Human Rights, everyone has a right to be heard in their own language in a court of law. Well, sometimes a speaker will not be somebody who speaks a standard language, and translation services have to be made available for someone who is a defendant in a legal matter in that kind of situation. So again, linguistics has a role to play there in suggesting how those translation services might be set up.